Arthur, you have heard me correctly. All that is required of you is to sign the necessary documents, after which you will be free to go. My wife, Annie, with whom I was married for over 25 years, spoke to me. I attempted to listen, but her voice gradually receded in the distance as her disapproval of me continued. The situation began that afternoon when I returned home from work. She sat at the table with a glass of wine and a determined expression on her face. However, she only had one glass, which she drank from because the situation was becoming increasingly complex. She did not consider that I might appreciate a drink or that, given the nature of the conversation, I might require one as well. I was aware that this was going to be the case. She did not inquire about my day, she immediately informed me of her intention to leave me. Annie had discovered a partner with whom she was deeply in love, someone who evoked a profound emotional response within her that I was no longer able to elicit. It was challenging for me to hear her, and as her voice grew louder, everything seemed to become increasingly muted to me. Our relationship was fairly typical of Annie and I. We met in high school and remained together until our daughter, Sally, was born approximately 6 months after we got married. While she was not the primary motivation for our marriage, it was still a topic of discussion today. We both held gainful employment, although we were not wealthy. We would characterize our socioeconomic status as upper middle class. We had already paid off a house a few years ago and had a decent savings account. We often expressed our love for each other, took regular family vacations, and although we did not engage in sexual intercourse as frequently as when we first got married, we still averaged a couple times a week. I believed we loved each other deeply and would say we would grow old together. However, today, Annie was still ranting, her face turning red as she continued to tell me what was going on. Arthur, look at me. It was becoming difficult for me to concentrate, but I turned my head towards her. You must sign these papers. She continued. She gestured to the documents on the table in front of me, her voice demanding, but I found it challenging to concentrate. The light and colors in the room appeared to fade, although the kitchen light remained on. Mentally, I was distressed, yet my body remained unresponsive. As time passed without my reaction, Annie's anger intensified. The final recollection I have is of Annie slapping me. I did not perceive the impact, I merely assumed it would result in a prominent red mark on my face. However, I remained unable to move, and the world continued to descend into darkness. It was a lengthy day. Classes at the university were postponed due to an incident, and the electricity was disconnected. We were sent home, and I was unable to ascertain the reason for this decision. Upon returning home, I observed that the house was unusually quiet, and the lights were on in my father's vehicle, but not in mine. I proceeded to the kitchen and threw my belongings onto a chair. My father was seated at the table, but he did not acknowledge my presence. He simply gazed into the distance. On the opposite side of the table, an open bottle of wine belonging to my mother was situated, accompanied by an almost empty glass in front of my father. A stack of papers bearing numerous signatures and inscriptions was positioned in front of him. I approached my father from behind and touched his shoulder. I expected him to turn around and acknowledge my presence, but he did not respond. I continued to walk around him. I approached him and observed his face. His eyes were glazed over, appearing almost milky white, and it seemed as though tears were flowing from them. However, he did not blink, and a stream of saliva emerged from his mouth and began dripping onto his lap. I experienced a sense of panic, repeatedly calling out, "Dad, Dad, wake up." After approximately 1 minute, the subject did not respond. It was evident that the situation required a calm and methodical approach. The subject was informed that assistance was required and that the situation could potentially be life-threatening. The 911 operator was instructed to send an ambulance to the location. The subject's name, address, and other pertinent details were provided. I provided the emergency medical services personnel with our home address. They informed me that an ambulance would arrive within approximately 10 minutes. For the following few minutes, I sat and observed my father, holding his hand. I spoke to him quietly, reassuring him that everything would be okay. This man played an instrumental role in my upbringing. Despite working numerous hours, he was consistently present at my educational institutions. He also supported my interest in musical theater and ballet and provided guidance and encouragement as I began to learn the violin. He invested significant time and effort into this endeavor and eventually saved sufficient funds to purchase a high-assigned violin for my 16th birthday. While it was not the finest instrument, it was a notable improvement over my previous one. 5 years later, I was enrolled in a university program specializing in music, with a particular focus on strings and the violin. I possessed 2 additional violins of superior quality, yet this instrument held a unique significance in my heart, as it had been gifted to me by my father. As I awaited the arrival of the ambulance, I was uncertain about how to proceed. I was perplexed by my father's actions and the circumstances surrounding my mother's absence. At that time, I happened to look at the documents and noticed the word petition for divorce. I read the first page of the document in a couple of minutes and experienced a sensation of goosebumps on my skin. My mother expressed a desire to divorce my father, which seemed to be a probable outcome given the circumstances. The documents were the cause of this emotional response. Based on the manner in which my mother opened her wine, it is reasonable to conclude that she provided my father with the documents and subsequently departed. It is notable that individuals often fail to recognize the rapidity with which emotions can shift. I believe this phenomenon has never previously occurred to them. I experienced a diminution in my capacity for compassion and a waning of my desire to be with my mother. Subsequently, an ambulance was dispatched and my father was transported to the hospital. I was driving behind, having secured the residence and initiated contact along the route. I first contacted my grandmother, my father's mother, his sister Rhonda, and his close associate. She then reached out to his supervisor at the workplace to inform them of his imminent absence. I informed them that I had returned home to find him unresponsive and en route to the hospital. They all requested that I provide updates on his condition, and his manager told me that he would arrange emergency leave for Dad and inform their boss. I was aware that I was postponing the next call because I was so angry with her, but I decided to proceed. I needed to call my mother. The phone rang and she picked it up after a couple of rings. "Hello, Sally. My dear, how was your day?" "Wow. Just wow." My mother was not naive enough to believe that I was unaware of what was going on. Nearly an hour had passed since I entered the house and found my father. My mother was aware of my schedule. Once it became evident to her that I was already home and had learned the full extent of the situation, I inquired as to her whereabouts. I informed her that I had left her father. She remained silent, indicating her reluctance to respond. I sensed her hesitation, and in essence, I conveyed that she had effectively destroyed my father, my husband, and left him without consideration. In an attempt to clarify, I attempted to explain the circumstances. She informed her father about Paul and the circumstances surrounding their relationship, but he did not respond, leading her to believe it was best to leave and allow him to realize that they would no longer be together. She attempted to present it as a simple decision, but given her discovery of her father's condition, it was likely that she had experienced a profound emotional impact. While he observed, I inquired as to whether my assumption was accurate, that you had abandoned him when he required assistance. Are you truly devoid of compassion? Do you possess an awareness of the circumstances, or do you remain indifferent? Anger began to manifest in my voice. I implore you not to become enraged. I recognize that this may be a somewhat disconcerting revelation, but I assure you that your father will ultimately recover. I will only request what is rightfully mine. Furthermore, I would appreciate some support while Paul awaits my marriage. It is evident that my mother has lost touch with reality. I am currently en route to the hospital to collect my father, who is currently in the ambulance. Upon my return home, he appeared to have suffered a stroke. I am deeply saddened to hear this, Sally. This, but no buts. Mother, allow me to inquire, is this Paul the individual you intend to visit, the same Paul from your place of employment whom you have frequently discussed? She paused, then replied in the affirmative. Paul was the person at my mother's workplace about whom she was perpetually loquacious, so I surmise that he is approximately a dozen years her junior. For how long have you been engaged in an extramarital relationship with him? She paused once more, indicating that the affair had been ongoing for 6 months. This meant that for the past 6 months, she had been engaging in sexual relations with someone from her workplace, all while deceiving her father and me about the nature of her relationship with this individual. It was evident that neither my father nor I was aware of the extent of the relationship. The condition in which you left him would suggest that you had been keeping this information from us both. Did you anticipate that we would be pleased about this? I must admit that I did not. However, once we have resided with Paul for a period of time, you will recognize that we are well suited for each other. She just mentioned it in the plural for the second time. Did she believe that I would abandon my father and take up residence with her and her partner? I felt like I was overcome with rage. I knew that if I did not cease my verbal outburst, I would say something I might regret. I am going to terminate the call now before I say something I may not be able to take back. Let me be absolutely clear, I will not be moving away from my father, and there is no way I will go anywhere near Paul, let alone anywhere near his house. His house, where you are with him, Sally Smith, she shouted. I am your mother, and you will not speak to me in such a manner, regardless of how distressed you may be. I believe we have reached the limit of our discussion, and I terminated the call before she could say anything further. If she believed I would condone her actions, she was mistaken. She attempted to contact me on several occasions. Subsequently, she began contacting my father's phone number, which was an ill-advised move, as even if he possessed the phone, it is unlikely that he would have responded to her call. I had my father's phone, so I disregarded all her calls. By the time I reached the hospital, the ambulance crew had admitted my father, and he was in the room under observation. Aunt Rhonda she arrived and informed me that she had also received several calls from my mother, but was uncertain about the circumstances surrounding them. When I explained the situation, Aunt Rhonda blushed significantly, indicating her embarrassment. Sally, do you have the documents that left for my brother? Of course. Aunt Rhonda, here, in addition to being my Aunt Rhonda, was also our family lawyer. For the next hour, we sat next to Dad while Rhonda read the documents and took notes, occasionally swearing under her breath. Doctors and nurses periodically came in and out of the room, checking on Dad. The bad news was that the timeline indicates that the dissolution of the marriage has been ongoing for over 2 months. The divorce proceedings should have been initiated by this week, as any further delay would have incurred significant additional costs, exceeding the fees charged by the legal team. I acknowledged the circumstances surrounding my mother's actions, which provided justifications for her actions. However, I had reached a point where I was no longer willing to accept her behavior. She desired that her father be with her, which was an unusual sentiment given that I had never considered myself a daddy's girl. Instead, I had always looked up to my mother. However, her actions were simply reprehensible. Paul, her alleged soulmate, had committed adultery. It was evident that my parents' marriage was no longer viable. Rhonda proceeded to hire an unscrupulous lawyer to represent her. She will have to pay him handsomely for his services. A significant amount has been spent on the divorce proceedings, with further costs likely to be incurred if the case proceeds to court. My sister has employed the services of a lawyer with a reputation for representing clients in similar circumstances, while my brother has secured the services of a highly regarded legal professional at a reduced rate. That evening, we shared a moment of mutual understanding and recognition. Additionally, the claims made by my sister include a request for 50% of the proceeds from the sale of the family home and 60% of it seems likely that the financial assets, along with the spousal and child support, are excessive. From your reaction, I surmise that you do not intend to live with your mother. I am of the opinion that your father's situation will become clearer within the next 24 hours. It is possible that your mother may already be in trouble. She could be facing charges of abandonment and mental cruelty. The following days passed rapidly as medical personnel repeatedly checked on the patient's condition. He appeared physically healthy, yet unresponsive. I stuttered in a hospital chair by the bedside, laptop and textbook in hand. Periodically, a family member would arrive. I would take a break and return home to rest for a few hours and change my clothes. I must admit that I shed a considerable number of tears when I was alone in the house. One of the most unexpected occurrences was that the proprietor of the company where my father was employed came to inquire after his well-being. Although I was acquainted with his manager, Tom, I had never had the opportunity to meet his actual superior. Tina Williams was a striking woman. She had a sensual, slender physique, tanned skin, dark raven hair, and blue eyes that sparkled, indicating a certain charisma. It was evident that she exuded a certain allure, capable of inspiring admiration in both men and women. My father was among a group of colleagues who supported Tina during a challenging period in her personal life. Several years ago, she experienced a messy divorce following the infidelity of her former spouse. The husband attempted to remove his daughter from her mother's care and control the majority of their financial assets. He nearly succeeded in seizing half of her business before her father introduced her to Aunt Rhonda. Rhonda facilitated a resolution that did not require Tina to relinquish any portion of her business and ensured that Tina received child support for their then 6-year-old. My daughter, Tina, visited on several occasions and was visibly shocked when I informed her of the circumstances surrounding my father's hospitalization and the reasons for his presence in the medical facility. She would often bring cards from colleagues at my father's workplace and spend time holding his hand, recounting stories from the office that had transpired during his absence. It became evident that my father was a highly engaging individual in his professional setting. His colleagues expressed a keen interest in his antics and actions. It should be noted that my father is a certified accountant and employed by a financial company that facilitates the processing of payments for various financial institutions. While the job can be demanding, it seems that the incident served to brighten the workday for everyone. Approximately 2 weeks later, I had just returned from home when I entered the room. Rhonda and Tina were concluding their conversation. I could discern that the discussion was somewhat heated, yet their anger was directed at my mother, not at each other. My mother had written a letter to Tina, demanding that she be granted access to all of my father's bonuses from the previous few years. The letter made no distinction between the money that had already been paid and that which was still outstanding. It demanded that she receive 50% of the total in a specified bank account within 30 days, or she would sue. Tina's request for money was, at the very least, ill-advised. Given that the funds in question had already been paid, it appeared that both she and her new companion were experiencing financial difficulties. This was particularly evident given that Arthur was undergoing treatment. Rhonda then made a statement with a distinctly predatory grin, to which I responded by announcing my presence. This morning, I received my first message from my mother in 2 weeks, a text message. She inquired about the possibility of receiving financial assistance, but I declined to respond as I was still grappling with the emotional distress caused by her actions. It is noteworthy that she has not inquired about my father's well-being since I informed her of the detrimental impact her behavior has had on him over the past few weeks. Tina has also expressed concern about my father's emotional distress whenever my mother's name is mentioned, as evidenced by her narrowed eyes and lowered voice. Her eyes were narrow and her voice dropped an octave, indicating a deep dislike. It was as if I could see flames appearing around the edges of those burning eyes. I hoped she would never have to sit in a room with my mother, as I was afraid she might burn it down. I may not love my mother very much now. However, she remained my mother. She had destroyed the most wonderful person. Sally, had it not been for your father, I would not have my Clarissa or my business. Many people in the office assisted me during one of the most challenging periods of my life. However, your father spent a considerable amount of time listening to me. He never judged my former husband. My husband or I, he simply allowed me to express my feelings. No one has ever truly done this without offering their opinion. He introduced me to your aunt, ensuring that I was well taken care of. If he were a single man, I would have pursued him with great enthusiasm. After the divorce, I simply shrugged and allowed a smile to light up my face. Well, that was then. This information brought realization to their faces. Rhonda giggled and Tina smiled. Thank you, Sally. I needed that. I still can't believe what your mother did to him or that she rejected such a wonderful man. I have to go to the office, but first, I'll do this. Tina walked up to my father. As Rhonda and I observed the scene, she leaned over and kissed him gently but sincerely on the lips. She then looked at us and smiled, but her expression changed to one of shock. Moments later, my father groaned. When I woke up, I felt soft lips on mine, with just the right amount of pressure, and behind them was a sensual and the kiss conveyed an affection I had not experienced in a long time. I heard the beeping of medical equipment and myself groaning as almost every muscle in my body ached. I expected Annie to be standing over my bed when I opened my eyes after such a tender kiss, but there was Tina standing. Tina, Sally, and Rhonda approached from the other side of the bed. Everything will be fine, Daddy, Tina said. You'll be okay. My memories suddenly became vivid, and I realized that Annie had already left me. What had happened? Over the following minutes, the three women proceeded to provide me with a detailed account of the events that had transpired. They informed me that Sally had discovered my unresponsiveness and subsequently contacted the emergency services. They also revealed that she had come across divorce papers that indicated Annie had been unfaithful to me for an extended period. Additionally, I was made aware of the fact that Annie had threatened Tina on one occasion when Rhonda had attempted to intervene. They proceeded to discuss my financial situation until they discovered the circumstances surrounding my condition. After Rhonda responded, I looked at Tina. "Tina, did you kiss me?" Tina blushed and replied, "Yes, sorry. I was returning to the office to say goodbye." I smiled and reassured her, "No, everything is okay. I'm already in the market, so I believe it's acceptable." Over the course of several hours, I underwent a series of medical examinations and underwent a series of blood tests and an MRI. Tina cancelled her scheduled visit to the office and remained at the residence, as did Rhonda and Sally. Among the medical professionals who came to see me was a psychologist. I informed him of how I had returned home and discovered Annie consuming alcohol alone, and she informed me that she was departing. I informed him that as the intensity of the assault increased, I experienced a loss of color perception, auditory hallucinations, and difficulty moving, despite my desire to do so. My final recollection was of Annie striking me in the face and shouting at me, though I was unable to comprehend her utterances. The girls collectively expressed shock upon learning that Annie had physically assaulted me while I was unable to respond. "Father, could you estimate the time of this incident?" I would postulate that it occurred around 5 p.m. "Why do you require this information?" "Because I returned home at approximately 7:30 p.m. and discovered you were alone." The psychologist intervened, noting that it is not uncommon for individuals in such circumstances to be abused while remaining silent. In this case, it is plausible to suggest that the subject experienced a state of shock upon hearing his wife's announcement of her intention to leave him. While this instance is more extreme than the typical cases encountered, the observed behavior is understandable. Rhonda spoke when Arthur was young. There was a bully who was several years older than him. He frequently teased Arthur, and on one occasion, a parent in the neighborhood discovered Arthur lying on the ground in the park. According to the information provided by our parents, the parents of the neighborhood child placed he was taken to bed, and upon waking the following morning, no one considered the incident noteworthy. However, it did occur. I recall Billy's actions, including pushing and teasing me in the park. After a period of time, I am unsure of the specifics of what occurred, but upon waking, I was in my mother's care. My father informed me that I had lost consciousness. Someone subsequently transported me home. Upon disclosing the incident to his parents, they contacted Billy's parents the following day. Billy approached me at school and expressed remorse. I recall the gesture as somewhat insincere, yet it ceased any further harassment. Once more, it appears that there is a degree of repetition in this account. The psychologist posited that the mind is still poorly understood in many ways. However, if something like this has occurred previously, it is logical to conclude that it could happen again. I frowned, and he smiled. I was advised not to be overly concerned about the love and attention of these three lovely ladies, even if something happens again. It was implied that I would be well taken care of. We conversed for a few more minutes. Minutes before he excused himself and left, I also felt tired. This may sound strange to someone who has been sleeping for the past 2 weeks, but I was tired, so I sent all 3 girls home to get some rest and told them they could come see me the next day to ensure my well-being. The following 2 days brought me back to life. Tina brought me a work laptop and gave me a few simple tasks to complete, just to keep me occupied. Rhonda stopped. The purpose of this meeting was twofold: firstly, to present me with the amended divorce papers and request my signature so that proceedings could commence towards the dissolution of my marriage to Annie; secondly, to facilitate an interview with me by Detective Hill, who questioned me at length about my experiences that night with Annie. Detective Hill thanked me and informed Rhonda and me that we would receive her report in a few days. I was uncertain as to whether a formal complaint was being filed. After a period of deliberation, Rhonda informed me that she would handle the matter of filing a complaint against Annie. She then kissed my forehead and departed in the afternoon of the second day. Upon waking, I was released from the hospital and subsequently discharged so that I could return home. Sally accompanied me, and I was surprised when Tina met us outside the building and helped Sally walk me to her large SUV. Tina stayed for dinner that evening and helped clean up afterwards. She then remained with us for a couple of hours to watch television. As she turned to leave, Sally embraced her and then ensured that I proceeded to her vehicle. I would like to express my gratitude to you for all that you have done over the past few weeks. I am unsure how I can possibly repay you. The woman who had kissed me earlier that evening invited me on a date. She was attractive and I was soon to become a bachelor again. The next Friday evening, after work, I would have almost 2 weeks to recuperate. She nodded and came over and hugged me tightly. It lingered a little longer and I sensed more hidden meaning as she got into her car. I found it amusing that I briefly wondered what was the name of this peculiar woman with whom I had been married for approximately 25 years. Over the following days, Sally, Rhonda, and Tina paid me frequent visits, checking to ensure my well-being. It was a pleasant change to be so thoroughly attended to. However, the news Rhonda brought me that Friday afternoon took us all somewhat by surprise. Annie was arrested that afternoon. She informed me that she had been detained following my statement to the police. The police at the hospital have issued a warrant for Annie's arrest based on allegations of mental cruelty towards a person with disabilities. This is based on the fact that at the time you were immobilized and unable to defend yourself. Additionally, she left you without supervision or help for an unknown amount of time, which further exacerbates the situation. What implications does this have for the potential divorce proceedings? Tina, who has joined us again for dinner at the age of 8, a year-old daughter Clarice was with her that evening. Clarice was watching a Disney movie in the living room while we talked. I was returning to work on Monday, so Tina would meet me there. However, I was beginning to realize that she needed more than just efficient number crunching in the office. I found myself imagining what was hidden under those beautiful tight clothes she wore every time she came to visit. Rhonda smiled. This will probably mean that some things will go in Arthur's favor. Judging by the state of the bank accounts and the house, I insist on a 50-50 split. I know we could have done more. Nevertheless, I assume Arthur will want to be fair. I nodded in agreement. Annie will not be able to access any of the bonus money she attempted to obtain from you, Tina. I have filed a case against her for extortion in addition to charges of mental cruelty. However, this will only serve to temporarily halt her actions. It is likely that she will emerge from this ordeal in a couple of days with no ill effects and able to resume her relationship with her alleged soulmate. My intention is to conclude the divorce proceedings expeditiously, utilizing Arthur's hospital visit as a potential opportunity for resolution. Following this, I have formulated a plan contingent upon her response. She reacted by stating that she would ensure that no superfluous items were taken from Arthur. She then smiled. How long will the divorce take? Aunt Rhonda inquired of Sally. I believe that everything is going well. It should take approximately 3 months, provided that Annie does not wish to contest the proceedings. In that case, I will enlist the assistance of legal counsel, which will prolong the process. The divorce proceedings will undoubtedly be protracted, but the emotional distress she will endure will be significantly magnified that evening. As I escorted Tina to her vehicle, Sally assisted Clarissa into the rear seating area. Tina embraced me once more and bestowed upon me a brief kiss, evoking memories of our encounter the previous day. Arthur, I am aware that you are wed and that you adhere to the tenets of honesty. Consequently, I am not inclined to hasten the process, but I wish to claim you now and inform you of my desire to be with you. I have desired you for a considerable period of time, but I would never pursue a married man or violate the sanctity of another person's marriage vows. I have experienced such a situation myself, and I am disinclined to see it happen to anyone else, even if their marriage is. I gazed into her deep blue eyes for a moment and brushed a strand of her dark raven hair out of her face. I then leaned in to kiss her. Instead of a soft and gentle kiss, I allowed the kiss to be passionate for approximately 30 seconds. I was aware that we both felt connected, and Tina's eyes were closed. Upon my withdrawal from the kiss and her subsequent licking of my lips, I smiled, indicating that I was aware of our mutual attraction. I then informed her of my intentions, confirming her rights. We then turned to observe the girls, who were both laughing as they watched us kiss. Clarissa was clapping her hands while Sally had a large grin on her face. As Tina and Clarissa exited the driveway, Sally embraced me and we exchanged a gesture of farewell. The subsequent months proved to be a period of considerable emotional turbulence. On the one hand, Annie expressed a desire for the divorce proceedings to conclude expeditiously. Conversely, she was not satisfied with the terms of the agreement. It appeared that Paul was in a position of considerable influence. He informed her that she should receive the majority of the assets, which was an inaccurate representation of the facts. After many years of marriage, she was likely aware of the inaccuracy. As the settlement demands became increasingly unreasonable, Rhonda contacted Annie's lawyer. The specific details of the conversation are unknown, but the objections to the settlement ceased immediately. Tina and I met every Friday night while Sally began babysitting Clarice, picking her up from school and monitoring her. This allowed Tina and I time to have dinner, drink coffee, watch a show, or go dancing. We never engaged in any further physical contact and kiss, but I had a feeling that the evening of my divorce would be something different. I resumed my professional activities and everything was going well for us. As a financial institution, we made a good profit, but we weren't in the upper echelons of the industry. We all performed our duties, were compensated accordingly, and generally enjoyed one another's company. I believe the staff was aware that at some point, Tina and I were becoming romantically involved. While everyone was supportive of both of us, I had to temper my usual behavior. My line manager, who reported to Tina, ensured that no one discussed our conduct in the workplace. Given that I was practically meeting with his boss approximately 3.5 months later, we received notice that the divorce would be finalized in a week, commencing the following Thursday. There was no trial, but Annie requested a meeting to discuss the matter before the final ruling. I agreed the day before, and we agreed that she would come to the house to see Sally and me. I took the afternoon off and prepared lamb chops and dumplings with gravy for the three of us. It was a favorite dish for all three of us, and I hoped it would facilitate more relaxed evening conversations. Sally arrived at approximately 5:30 p.m. After showering and changing, I heard the doorbell ring at approximately 6 o'clock. Annie was standing at the front door. I have not previously described Annie in detail, but I will do so now, before everything fell apart a few months ago. Annie was an attractive housewife in her 40s. She had short, shoulder-length brown hair, a curvy mom figure, and although she weighed a few pounds more than she liked, she was still very attractive with a great bust and an ass to match. She was a great-looking woman, but it was unfortunate that the woman standing in front of me was almost unrecognizable. Annie had gained a significant amount of weight. She had developed jowls and prominent cheeks. Her abdomen, which had always been slightly protruding, now hung over her pants. Additionally, her previously curvaceous midsection had become noticeably swollen. She was also wearing loose-fitting attire that concealed her increased body size. While I do not oppose individuals with larger body types, this was not the Annie I knew. My disbelief at her physical transformation was evident on my face. Annie winced but did not speak. She entered the house with a polite greeting. We proceeded to the kitchen, where I offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted. We engaged in a brief discussion about trifles, after which she inquired about my work and my personal well-being. I inquired about her work and refrained from commenting on her need to prioritize her own health. This is a matter that Paul has emphasized. He was not pleased with my weight, so we collaborated on strategies to facilitate weight gain. She brought up the unspoken question. I had been frowning for over 2 decades. I had a profound affection for this woman, yet despite her actions toward me, Annie, I am concerned about your health. Do you approve? No, Annie. During our relationship, you were an excellent, slim, healthy individual. However, I must admit that I am shocked by your current appearance. You do not appear to be well, and if I were not so hurt by your actions, I would be very worried about your health and would try to help you. Do you not care at all? Her face fell. Sally seemed happy and healthy without her presence. There is a part of me that cares, but when you left and essentially abandoned me, I was left with no choice but to accept the situation. I deserve it, don't I? She sighed. I did a terrible thing, didn't I? Sally had just emerged from the shower. You did a terrible thing. You single-handedly tore a happy family apart and then walked out the door without a care in the world. You have effectively disassembled a content family and subsequently departed without a second thought, and I am at a loss to comprehend why Dad consented to your presence here tonight. Sally, it is imperative that you compose yourself. Your mother is aware of our circumstances and the pervasive despondency that pervades our household. Your mother requested this meeting, and thus it is incumbent upon us to conduct ourselves in a mature and respectful manner. Sally, I could not ascertain whether she was displeased, but I could discern from the way my daughter regarded her mother that she had not spoken to her mother since that fateful day. It was evident that this situation was not conducive to a positive outcome. It was therefore necessary to redirect the discussion. I attempted to appear cheerful, as difficult conversations are not conducive to an empty stomach. Therefore, I proposed that we eat first. I served dinner, and there was no response from the other party. However, there were numerous glances exchanged between them. Throughout the meal, Sally maintained eye contact with her mother. After dinner, I cleared the table, and Annie requested a private conversation with Sally. It was clear that she was not willing to discuss anything with both of us present. I was surprised, but I could see that Sally was determined not to be alone with her mother. Her mother, I believe Annie also observed this. The expression in her eyes was identical to her mother's when she did this to me on that fateful night. Annie nodded, took a deep breath, and began. She did want to do this in front of me, but she looked at Sally. Sally, I want to ask you to forgive me. I am here to atone for my actions that night. I believe that I was wrong, and I do not wish to be separated from my daughter permanently. Annie looked at me and said, there is one more thing, but I would prefer to say it in private and not in front of your father. I'm sorry, Mom, but if you can't say it to me, then I don't want to hear it. Both of us, I replied. I do not wish to hear it from you in that tone of voice before Annie could do anything else. Sally stood up and left a moment later. We heard her bedroom door slam. You engaged in a long-term sexual relationship with another individual, yet you concealed this from both Sally and me. Then, abruptly, you presented me with divorce papers. After I had already endured the initial shock and was rendered speechless, you began to scream and then slap me. Annie appeared to be rendered immobile, as if she were a deer caught in headlights. I still retain memories of the majority of the confrontation, up until the moment you struck me, can be summarized as follows. Let us continue. You subsequently leave me at a point when I do not react, until Sally returns home and discovers me in a state of distress. Annie appeared fearful. When Sally calls, you demonstrate a lack of concern. You demonstrated no concern for my well-being when your daughter was visibly distressed about her father's actions. You did not inquire about my health until tonight. You made demands of your employer that were not reasonable. When you entered the room, your focus remained on yourself. You asked Sally to forgive you, but you did not express remorse to her. I paused to see if your words would resonate with her. Annie, I believe that, given all that has transpired, the meeting went well. Annie was looking at the floor with tears in her eyes. They had not yet fallen, but they were imminent. I was unsure if it was unclear whether the tears were for Sally, for me, or for herself. I continued, stating that our divorce would be final the following day. If she had no further objections, then I believed we had fulfilled her request for a final meeting. I walked to the door and opened it. Annie looked at me and left, having crossed the threshold. She turned and looked at me. Arthur, we've really had a few good years, haven't we? Yes, Annie. Most of our time together was amazing. You were a wonderful lover, a caring wife, and a loving mother. I don't know what that idiot Paul did to you, but I don't see anything. The woman I fell in love with is no longer present in the man standing in front of me. Instead, I see a lost being who was manipulated by someone into gaining wealth like a pig and becoming selfish and uncaring about the people around her. She looked at her feet again. Do you truly mean it, Arthur? Yes, she turned to leave, then turned around one last time. This time, she looked broken. Annie regarded me with a puzzled expression, inquiring as to the source of my mirth. I advised her to inform her partner that, at the appointed hour, he would receive his portion of the accumulated savings and equity that had been held in this residence's bank account. This information had been conveyed to Rhonda and Annie by their legal counsel. Annie's gaze met mine, and I issued a solemn warning: to ensure the longevity of this financial legacy, it was imperative to keep it separate from Paul's access. The following morning, the final decree was enacted, formalizing Annie and my separation. While this transition was bittersweet, it was but a minor aspect of the larger transition. For the most part, I was elated, reflecting on the significant developments that had transpired over the past few months. It has not been an easy period for anyone. Now I was free, and at 48 years old I still had a considerable amount of life remaining. Rhonda called me and said that she would have pizza at my house that evening. Sally dropped by the office for lunch. We discussed her mother and happier times when we were a family. I am aware that she did not love her mother very much, but I know she missed the woman she used to be. I must admit that I also missed those good years. Well, I believe there was a signal between Sally and Tina when Sally left. Not even 5 minutes later I was called into Tina's office, where she abruptly closed the door and kissed me with a fervor that suggested the imminent demise of the sun. I am compelled to acknowledge that I may have reciprocated in a similar manner. I now proclaim your possession of my affections, Arthur. I discerned a tender spot on my neck where a hickey may have been left by her lips a moment ago. I believe you may have already initiated this act. The evening's repast was most agreeable. Sally, Rhonda, Tina, and Clarissa were in my company, and we celebrated my emancipation from Annie that Friday night while the girls were in bed. Tina and I consummated our relationship, which had previously been platonic. I had evidently done something right, because for the remainder of the weekend, each time she sat down, she emitted a slight squeaking sound as if she were experiencing minor discomfort. However, her eyes, which were typically calm and serene, now burned with a fire that I knew was only for me. 6 months later, we were married in a beautiful, intimate ceremony at a local lake, with numerous colleagues from our workplace in attendance. We had expressed our desire to be married before Sally and Clarissa's younger brother was born. It was 5 years later. Sally, her romantic partner, Tina, and I had just taken our seats for dinner at one of our local restaurants when a year has elapsed. Old Keegan inquired of his father as to the identity of the woman who had been staring at them. They all turned around and saw Annie sitting across from them. She had lost a great deal of weight and appeared displeased with herself. They have not seen or heard from her since they got divorced. She never even attempted to contact Sally. I apologized to the family and approached her. "Hello Annie, hello Arthur, how are you doing?" She regarded the chicken salad she was eating. "You were right, Arthur. You were right about him. Paul convinced me that I was his soulmate and you were nothing but. When I didn't get the money up front, he convinced me to gain weight because he loved me and loved fat women. I obtained the financial compensation following the dissolution of our marriage. You advised me not to provide it to him, but I did not heed your counsel. He dissipated the funds within a couple of months and subsequently departed, refusing to marry me. I was still disgruntled with her, yet her narrative did not conclude on a positive note. From that point onward, I dedicated every moment to rebuilding the self-assurance he had undermined. She was devastated and sought to regain her former identity. She shed tears and gazed at me, her eyes reflecting the anguish of the Annie I had known. "Arthur, I am profoundly sorry for the way I treated you. I was under the impression that Paul was privy to information that you were not aware of. I ended the only relationship I had ever had with a man who had demonstrated genuine affection for me." She paused and grasped the edge of the table, and I was acutely aware that I had placed you in mortal danger. I am aware that I have caused you irreparable harm, and I am profoundly sorry. However, I feel compelled to say that. At that moment, Sally approached me and stood next to her mother. She had also heard the latter's apology. I looked at her and she smiled, albeit tiredly, and grasped my hand. It is unclear whether this was the first occasion on which she observed her mother expressing genuine remorse. Her gaze softened and she extended her hand to her mother, noticing the presence of Sally and then extending her own hand. Annie became visibly distressed and attempted to rise and walk away, but Sally obstructed her path. "Mother, do not insist on leaving," Sally urged, taking a seat in the adjacent booth. Next to Annie and I sat on the other side. I observed Tina nodding, and thus for the subsequent hour, the mother and daughter conversed. There were numerous instances of reconciliation, accompanied by a considerable amount of tears. However, on this occasion, the tears were not merely a source of distress, but rather, they signified a catharsis. Once the discussion had concluded, Sally and I introduced Annie to the group. From my observation, Annie was visibly distressed when she was introduced to Keegan as Aunt Annie. Following this event, we gradually permitted Annie to resume her role in our lives. Over time, Sally gradually re-established a connection with her mother. They would meet for coffee on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and as their trust in each other grew, so did their relationship. When Sally got married, Annie assumed the role of the mother of the bride. Tina would occasionally invite Annie to our house for dinner. From time to time, initially, it appeared to be out of spite for Annie for everything she had given up, and Tina benefited by marrying me. However, although they were never close, Tina and Annie had a peculiar friendship that was difficult to comprehend. Rhonda never forgave Annie for what she did to me, although she was always polite to her whenever they came into contact. With Tina's blessing, Annie and I did a little post-marital counseling. We discussed many of our problems since that time, more than 5 years ago. The consultant thought Annie might have hormonal problems, but Annie did not admit this. On that day, I discarded the most significant item in my possession. I had a husband who loved me and a daughter who wanted to be with me. No amount of hormonal imbalance can justify the way I systematically ruined everything positive in my life for someone who whispered sweet nothings in my ear. Earl, who was lacking in sexual performance and whose manhood was so small from the waist down that it was barely perceptible, smiled sweetly at me with this statement: "Arthur and Sally deserved much better from me." She then proceeded to cry and wiped her tears with a napkin. It took 5 years before I was able to reconnect with them. I lost 5 years of my life during this period and was not with them. I am grateful to Arthur for allowing me back into his life and to Tina as well. She blushed at this. She had every right to hate me, yet she treated me warmly every time we met. She was fortunate to gain everything I had discarded, and I will bear the consequences for the remainder of my life. Annie benefited from these sessions to a far greater extent than I did. It was helpful to confirm that neither Sally nor I had done anything to cause Annie to leave us. She was correct in her assessment. Tina picked us up and strengthened our family, as is often said. People pay for their mistakes if they make them. Paul remained in the area for a considerable period of time, during which he attempted to seduce a married woman and appropriate her financial resources. However, his efforts were thwarted when the husband discovered him in the act with his wife and subsequently initiated legal proceedings against him. Paul was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but it is believed that he will soon be released, based on information provided by Rhonda, who is now representing him. Tina and I share a profound and enduring love. I had never imagined that I would ever be capable of loving as deeply as I loved Annie, but Tina demonstrated that this is not the case. She not only bestowed upon me her love, but also her entire soul. Despite the dissolution of our relationship, we continue to collaborate professionally at her company, and I retain the same position. We experience fluctuations in our relationship, but we remain committed to maintaining open communication when it is necessary. Her physical condition remains exceptional, and we engage in frequent sexual intercourse. We even engaged in sexual intercourse in some exotic locales during our vacation. Typically, a mere glance is sufficient for me to lock the bedroom door and engage in sexual intercourse with her. One day, after engaging in sexual intercourse, we proceeded to shower, dress, and make our way to the kitchen. Upon arrival, we discovered Sally and Annie engaged in conversation. Last month, we learned that Sally was expecting a child, which created a palpable atmosphere of excitement and anticipation. The girls were preoccupied with planning for my first grandchild. Sally, I must say, her demeanor and conduct would lead one to believe she was still in her teenage years. Tina, you are responsible for providing Arthur with nourishment. Perhaps I can procure some of this to feed Fred. The other women present reacted with laughter, and I experienced a surge of embarrassment. Annie had been dating on an occasional basis recently, but nothing serious until Fred came along. My mother advised them to leave each other alone. From that point onward, my father was a man on a mission. He had been discharged from the hospital, and his previous libido had increased significantly. Annie fell silent, and Sally laughed, while Tina blushed for me. I simply sat back and grinned. I felt my libido returning as I observed Tina. I then proceeded to the bedroom, where Tina followed shortly thereafter and locked the door behind her. Undoubtedly, I was aroused. Subscribe to our channel to ensure your partner does not engage in infidelity. Continue reading the next story as it is more explicit than this one. If you are under 18, do not read further.